A sealed shaft under ancient ice. Steps carved into bedrock where no map shows a tunnel. A stone door that exhales air older than living memory. Inside, not just gold, rivers of it, but relics that shouldn't exist in the Yukon at all. Crosses hammered by hand. A blade shaped for battle. Bones crushed where workers once stood. Every warning says this place was meant to stay buried. Every reading says it could be the richest single hit in Parker Schnabel's career. $80 million worth of gold sits on the floor. And that's before the walls. If it's real, it changes the scale of modern Yukon mining. If it goes wrong, it could bury his legacy with everything else sealed down there. The ground has already chosen a side. The question now is simple. Does he keep digging, or does the mountain finish what it started a century ago? It began as just another frigid morning in the Yukon. Diesel engines roared against the cold. Breath turned to fog, and steel teeth chewed through permafrost older than anyone alive. It was routine until the ground replied. The cut groaned, gravel slumped, and one of the excavators slid sideways as if the earth had turned to glass. Everything stopped. Even the machines seemed to hold their breath. When the dust cleared, the crew stared into a black mouth framed by timber, hardened by time. It wasn't a collapse, it was construction. The hole didn't appear on any claim map. No survey had flagged it. Yet there it was. Stonework laid in precise geometric patterns, beams wedged neatly into place. The air that drifted out wasn't the warm breath of a mine. It was cold, metallic, and unnervingly still, like air from a vault opened for the first time. As Parker stepped closer, he saw something that made his pulse quicken. Bedrock steps, smooth and deliberate, leading downward into darkness. Every sign pointed to one thing. This wasn't natural. Someone had built it, and someone had buried it again. Early scans showed denser rock below, an echo of hollow space. The possibility of concentrated gold, untouched and sealed away for generations, became real. A find like that could dwarf every ounce Parker had ever pulled from the ground. But discoveries like this come with consequences. The crew shut off the engines. Shovels replaced steel buckets. Each scoop of dirt revealed more order, more design, and more reason to wonder what kind of hands had shaped this hidden shaft. The only way to find out was to go down. Ropes were rigged, harnesses double-checked, and the cold wind bit harder as Parker stood at the edge. Beneath him waited not just gold, but the unknown. As the crew dug by hand, the shape of the shaft became undeniable. The stones interlocked like puzzle pieces, each one placed with skill. Beams sat on carved ledges instead of being jammed randomly into dirt. Whoever built this wasn't rushing. They wanted it to last. Frost smoked from the opening, and the draft that touched their faces felt ancient, cold and mineral-rich, carrying the tang of something long sealed away. The more dirt they cleared, the stranger it became. Symbols appeared on the walls, circles, lines, even crude crosses etched into soot-blackened stone. They weren't signatures. They looked like warnings. The steps were smooth, not hacked, and the symmetry of the chamber above showed purpose. When samples from the wooden beams came back, the results stunned them. The tree rings dated a century before the Klondike Gold Rush. That meant whoever built this shaft wasn't a prospector from Dawson. They were here long before the gold fever of the 1890s. The Yukon isn't known for ancient structures, but the evidence said otherwise. Word spread through camp, and older locals who visited told stories about mountains that eat men, about gold hidden not to be found, but to be left alone. These were tales most miners had heard and ignored. Now, they didn't seem so funny. Parker stood at the edge of the opening as the wind died to nothing. Even the constant howl of the Yukon air went silent, as if the mountain itself was waiting. He knew there was no walking away from this. Not now. The descent would be dangerous, but he'd made his choice. The Earth had just presented him with a mystery that could rewrite history or destroy everything he'd built. With his harness secure, Parker stepped into the shaft. The world narrowed to a circle of light and the echo of his boots against stone. Air this old feels heavy. Every sound lingers. The soot stains along the walls told their own story. Someone else had burned fire here long ago. This tunnel wasn't carved by machines. It was dug by hand in darkness with purpose. Halfway down, his boot struck something metallic. When he leaned in, he saw a pickaxe head still wedged in the wall where it had been swung and abandoned. The handle was long gone, rotted to dust, but the iron still clung to the rock. Whoever used it hadn't left willingly. The stairs ended abruptly at a perfect stone disc sealed into the passage. It wasn't collapse, it was a door. Frost coated its surface, and beneath the ice, were carvings, stars, crosses, circles, all connected by fine lines like constellations. This was no miner's work, it was art, or ritual. The door hummed faintly when Parker pressed his glove against it. Behind it was empty space, a chamber, untouched for over a century. His crew joined him, chisels in hand. No blasting, no heavy strikes, just careful wedges and time. Every crack through the seal echoed like thunder. Then, with a low groan, the disc shifted forward. A gust of air burst through, so cold it burned their lungs. It was the breath of something that hadn't moved since the 1800s. Dust swirled, lights flickered, and through the haze, an impossible shimmer reflected back at them. What they saw wasn't just another shaft, it was a gateway into the past. The space beyond the seal stretched wide and high, more like a hall than a tunnel. The walls glittered faintly, catching the light of their headlamps. It wasn't pyrite, it was gold. Veins of it, thick and jagged, running through the rock like frozen lightning. And scattered across the floor, half buried in frost, lay nuggets the size of fists. Parker swept his scanner across the nearest wall. The readings spiked. 96, 97% purity. That kind of gold was almost unheard of. His breath fogged the air as he knelt to pick up a piece. It was heavy, smooth, and perfectly natural. But the deeper they looked, the stranger it became. The gold wasn't random. It was arranged. Nuggets piled in neat groups, almost symmetrical, as though someone had been sorting them before leaving in a hurry. Tools lay everywhere. Chisels, hammers, buckets, still half filled with stone chips. Whoever had been here last hadn't just mined. They'd been preparing for something. The chamber didn't feel empty. It felt watched. Every sound, every breath seemed to echo longer than it should. The crew's excitement gave way to unease. This much gold should have been a dream, but it didn't feel like one. It felt like they had walked into a room that wasn't meant to be disturbed. As the lamps swung across the glittering walls, the light seemed to move back, almost like the gold itself shimmered in warning. Parker's gut told him the truth. This was no ordinary deposit. It wasn't just a jackpot. It was a message, and the details kept insisting on it. Tally notches cut into a leaning plank, ending mid-count. A shallow trench on the floor where flakes had been raked into lines, then abandoned. A wooden cradle positioned beneath a fracture to catch whatever loosened from the face. Frost feathered along the vein edges where warm light met ancient cold, glazing bright metal with a thin, glassy skin. The quartz carried a web of microfractures, as if heat and pressure had tried to close the room and failed at the last moment. Even the scatter pattern on the ground told a story. Larger pieces near the center, fines swept toward the walls, footprints preserved as shallow depressions that ended abruptly at a collapsed scaffold. In one corner, a coil of rope had frozen into a single stiff curve beside a wedge, seated only halfway. The strike marks around it tight and hurried. The air itself felt layered, warmer near the ceiling, colder at the floor, making their breath fall like misting rain. When Parker muted his lamp and cupped a hand around the scanner, the quiet carried a soft ticking from deep in the rock, the sound of cooling stone or distant water. Either way, a reminder that this place was alive on its own terms. Nothing about the layout spoke of greed. It spoke of intent, of steps followed in order, of a task interrupted by something that didn't leave time to clean up. Standing there, surrounded by wealth most miners never see in a lifetime, he felt less like a discoverer and more like a reader arriving halfway through a sentence someone else had carved into the earth and then sealed. The room offered proof, but it also issued a warning. Understand why this was arranged, or repeat whatever ended it. While surveying the chamber, Parker's boot struck something buried under loose stones. He crouched and brushed away the dust, revealing an old leather pouch still intact despite the cold. Inside were two rough gold crosses, hammered unevenly but clearly made by hand. These weren't currency or decoration. They were symbols of belief. Alongside them lay a brittle scrap of parchment sealed with red wax. The writing was faint, but the flourished letters looked European, far older than anything that should have been in the Yukon. And then came the blade, curved, heavy, forged for combat, not for cutting rock. The realization hit like a chill. Whoever had been here wasn't a Klondike prospector. They belonged to another world entirely. As Parker's light swept across the floor, something else caught his eye. Bones, human bones, crushed, scattered, some half buried in the frost. There were animal remains, too, twisted under fallen timbers, harness rings still clinging to fragments of leather. The people who had once worked here hadn't escaped. They'd been sealed in with their gold. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. This chamber wasn't abandoned. It was entombed, and it hadn't been sealed to protect treasure. It was sealed to hide whatever had happened here. The crosses, the parchment, the blade, they weren't just artifacts. They were warnings left behind. Parker stared at the floor littered with relics and remains and felt the weight of the past pressing down. He had opened something that someone long ago had gone to great lengths to bury forever. The pouch was crafted from thick hide, stitched with sinew that had dried into wire. When Parker rubbed it clean, faint impressions showed symbols pressed into the leather, small marks in a language no one recognized. The crosses inside were rough but deliberate, shaped by hammer blows that left ripples along the edges. Whoever made them wasn't working with the finesse of a jeweler, but the urgency of a traveler. The parchment flaked at the corners, but under his light, traces of ink curved into what looked like prayers or invocations. A wax seal, barely clinging, bore a faded crest, two lines crossing over a circle. None of it matched anything from the Yukon or the 19th century. When the curved blade came into view, every man froze. Its spine was thick, its edge still faintly sharp despite the rust. The handle was wrapped in fragments of blackened leather, shaped to fit a gloved hand. It wasn't built for mining, it was built for fighting, for survival. The implications were impossible to ignore. Whoever worked here came prepared for more than gold. They expected danger. Near the relics, Parker found what looked like an old journal cover, the pages long rotted away. The remaining bindings hinted that someone had tried to record this expedition, but the story had ended before it could be told. When his light moved further, the truth unfolded in fragments, collapsed scaffolding, splintered planks driven into the dirt, and beneath them, the unmistakable outline of human ribs encased in ice. No miner could look at that and think abandoned. It was a grave. The ceiling still held the marks of failed supports, where wooden beams had snapped under the crushing weight of stone. Someone had tried to shore it up. They hadn't been fast enough. Bones and tools mixed together, frozen in their final motion. And yet, something about the scene didn't add up. Some remains lay carefully positioned, as if moved later. Bodies placed near the center, rather than scattered by collapse. It looked less like an accident and more like a burial, a deliberate sealing. Maybe the chamber hadn't caved in by chance. Maybe it was closed on purpose. The relics suddenly felt less like discoveries and more like messages, tokens left by those who knew this place shouldn't be opened again. Parker held the small gold crosses in his palm and felt their cold weight sink into him. They weren't treasure. They were proof of warning. Proof that someone, long before him, had tried to silence what lay beneath the Yukon, and that he had just broken the seal they died to protect. When the seal was breached, the world above began to change. The next morning, engines refused to start. Diesel coughed black smoke and died. Drills that had run smoothly the day before jammed without reason. Belts snapped. Sensors failed. No explanation fit. Everything mechanical seemed to resist. The moment the chamber was opened, the camp itself began to fall apart. Then came the gas. It started as a faint hiss from deep within the tunnel. Then the detectors screamed. The crew stumbled into the freezing air, coughing, eyes burning. Poison seeped from cracks that had been sealed for over a century. The discovery was rich, but it was also deadly. Locals who heard about the find arrived with warnings. Elders spoke quietly, their voices carrying the weight of generations. They told stories of sleeping veins and forbidden ground, places where men had vanished after uncovering what should have stayed buried. Most of the crew laughed it off, but when two mechanics refused to return underground, no one blamed them. The shaft itself seemed to fight back. Machines froze. The air thickened. The mountain groaned as if alive. Parker could feel it in his gut. The earth wasn't done with them. The chamber might hold unimaginable wealth, but it also held something else, something that didn't want to be disturbed. The deeper they dug, the more the Yukon seemed to push back. Word of the discovery spread faster than the frost. Within weeks, headlines screamed about Parker Schnabel's hidden gold vault. Experts arrived, followed by historians, journalists, and finally, government officials. The site that had once been a quiet claim was suddenly the center of global attention. Scientists wanted samples. Museums demanded the relics. Bureaucrats began citing ownership laws. Was this a gold claim, or was it now an archaeological site? The question no longer had an easy answer. Parker's crew was divided. Half wanted wanted to keep digging, chasing what could be the biggest gold strike in modern history. The other half refused to go back underground, calling the chamber cursed. The relics, the crosses, the parchment, the strange blade became the focus of endless debate. Historians claimed they were evidence of pre-Klondike explorers. Some went as far as to say that European traders or even early crusaders had reached this far north centuries earlier. No one could agree, and every new theory pulled Parker further from what he understood best: mining. For the first time in his career, gold wasn't just gold. It was a storm. The find that should have made him rich now threatened to consume him in lawsuits, headlines, and rumors. Still, Parker couldn't let it go. He'd come too far. Whatever the chamber really was, a vault, a tomb, or something in between, he was determined to find the truth, even if it meant fighting everyone who told him to stop. One night, long after the camp had gone quiet, Parker descended alone. The tunnel breathed around him, every drip of melting frost echoing like a clock ticking in the dark. His headlamp cut through the cold mist, landing on the walls that glowed faintly with gold. It wasn't greed that pulled him back, it was curiosity. The relics lay on a table where he'd left them. The crosses, the parchment, the fragment of the blade. They looked less like treasure now and more like evidence. Proof of a story older than history books dared to tell. On the far wall, a narrow crack whispered faint air. Another passage, deeper, untouched. The kind of path no one sane would explore without backup. But Parker wasn't thinking of fear. He was thinking of legacy. This was the moment that separated stories told by miners from legends carved into stone. He held a nugget of gold in his glove, its weight heavier than before. Not just because of its value, but because of what it represented. The line between fortune and fate. The chamber seemed alive again, the air thick with unspoken history. Maybe it was a vault meant to protect wealth. Maybe it was a tomb built to keep something sealed inside. Either way, the decision to go deeper was his alone. Parker looked once more into the darkness, knowing that whatever waited beyond would either cement his place in mining history or erase it. For him, it was never just about gold. It was about discovery, about unlocking the myths buried beneath ice and time. And now that the seal was broken, nothing could stop him from digging deeper. If you want to follow what happens next and see what's really hidden beneath the Yukon permafrost, make sure you're subscribed to Gold Era 2.0. The next chapter of this story might change everything we thought we knew about gold, history, and what truly lies beneath the frozen earth.